I'm very pleased that Delegate Brayboy and our distinguished panelists could be here to help us start that dialogue. The Honorable Aisha N. Brayboy, Esquire, is an accomplished lawyer with over 14 years of legal and legislative experience and is the first black female to be a candidate for Maryland Attorney General. She began her legal career at the Federal Communications Commission's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, where she worked on federal rulemaking and wireless spectrum auctions. For the past 10 years, Ms. Brayboy has served as pro bono legal counsel for the Community Public Awareness Council, a community-based juvenile diversionary program that has successfully diverted over 3,000 students out of the criminal justice system and provides counseling, mentoring, tutoring, and other services. In 2006, Ms. Brayboy was first elected to represent the 25th Legislative District in the Maryland House of Delegates and was re-elected in 2010. She was assigned to the House Economic Matters Committee, which has jurisdiction over energy, telecommunications, business regulations, labor insurance, and economic development. She was appointed by the Speaker of the House to serve as chair of the Consumer Protection Subcommittee. In addition, Ms. Brayboy was elected by her peers to serve as the chair of the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus, where she led the 44-member organization on a wide range of policy issues, including equal funding and parity for historically black colleges and universities, reducing mass incarceration for petty nonviolent offenses, women and minority-owned businesses, and reducing health disparities. Ms. Brayboy, who retired from the state legislature in 2015, left behind a powerful legacy marked by many awards and accomplishments. Some of her legislative accomplishments include raising Maryland's dropout age to 18, raising the minimum wage, requiring homeowners insurance companies to cover property losses of victims of violence, modernizing the Homeowners Association Act, regulating appraisal management companies, reauthorizing Maryland's racial profiling statute, and requiring racial and gender diversification and fair practices in law enforcement. Ms. Brayboy is a graduate of the University of Maryland at College Park and Howard University School of Law. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Aisha Brayboy.
Thank you so much for having me here today. When I listen to my bio, I'm often like, oh, I'm so embarrassed, because there's, you're just working, and I feel like I'm doing God's work, and just God has put so many wonderful opportunities in my path, and it's just been a pleasure to be able to serve people. When I left official public service, because I still feel like I'm serving, when I left official public service in January of this year, I went into a private practice. I've been of counsel to a law firm for the past 4 or 5 years. And this year, and in fact just last week, some of you might have seen one of my clients, and perhaps even me on the news. Last Friday, the Prince George's County State's Attorney's Office indicted a police officer in Prince George's County for assault and police misconduct. The victim of that assault is a client of our firm. And this is a gentleman who is a very hardworking. He is, I think he does, he works in the trades. He has a wife and 2 small children. And he was being dropped off by his cousin at his home in Mitchellville, in the Mitchellville area. And his cousin was, as many people do, just chit-chatting before he dropped him off. And an officer approached and said, "You can't park here." And the driver, who was not our client, he was the person who was dropping him off, said, "Well, I'm not parked, I'm just dropping my cousin off." He says, "Well, you gotta move, you can't be here." And so our client decides, you know what, I'm just gonna leave. So he gets out the car, he walks up to his door, and the officer follows him and pursues him. And you think about, he was the passenger in a vehicle, right? So let's just say, for the sake of argument, the vehicle was parked illegally. Certainly it is not the passenger's fault, so there's no reason for the officer to pursue the passenger. The officer pursued the passenger. When the passenger reached his doorstep, he was ordered to turn around and walk back. As he was walking back, the officer, and this is all on tape, and I know it was recorded, so I don't mind telling you, the officer unholstered his weapon and pointed the gun directly at my client's forehead. It looked like something out of a really bad gangster movie. I mean, it really did. It doesn't even look real. But not only did he point it directly at his head, and then lowered the gun to his mouth, but this gentleman was not resisting. He was actually charged with numerous offenses, including resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. And of course, as what would generally happen in that type of circumstance is that the individual would probably be charged, would be prosecuted, potentially either convicted or would plead to some lesser offenses. The only thing that saved our client is that his cousin turned on his phone and recorded the incident. And that's why the state's attorney indicted the case. You know, our client was charged and had a trial date. And so we provided the state's attorney's office with the evidence that we were going to produce at trial to show that our client, in fact, was not resisting arrest and was not just acting in a disorderly fashion. And upon receipt of that, the state's attorney's office dismissed the case against our client. And it took almost a year for the police to be indicted, but he ultimately was. And it's a relatively sad case because you have an officer who was a former, who served us in the military, who may have had some stressors related to that service. But at the end of the day, that behavior is unacceptable. It's unbecoming of an officer. And we know, and we have in our midst, you know, an outstanding police officer. And so most of our officers are really good, law-abiding citizens who just really want to serve. But when you have incidents where officers are using or abusing their authority, they have to be held accountable, just like the citizens here. If you commit a crime or an infraction, you ought to be held accountable. The same thing goes for police officers. And so, you know, our client, you know, was interesting. We were debating on whether or not we wanted him to speak, but of course all the media, we call them vultures, were coming to his home, and you know how that goes. So we decided to allow him to have an opportunity to address the media. And one of the things I shared with him was that, you know, most victims of police misconduct never get the opportunity that you're going to get because they are not going to be believed. They're not going to be, they would likely be prosecuted for whatever offenses they were charged with, and the officer would not be held accountable for his or her behavior. And so you have an opportunity to give voice to victims who would never have the opportunity to stand in your shoes. And he took that, you know, with a lot of, you know, he took that on that responsibility, and he spoke from his heart. And if you get a chance to just go on, you know, Fox 45 or WJLA or any of the major news networks, you'll be able to pull. His name is William Cunningham. That's the victim's name. So if you query his name in the search engines, you'll find them. But you know, since that time, I can't tell you. In fact, the reason why I was a little late coming here today is because I had another client come in who saw us and who had a similar incident. Well, her son had a similar incident. Because when you approach, just like in this instance with my client, when you approach a person where you have no real basis for approaching them, you end up involved in incidents that would otherwise have never taken place. This should have never happened because there was no reason for the officer to pursue or even approach my client or his cousin. So I definitely look forward to talking and the dialogue today. I think I'll stay for a little bit if you all let me to talk about solutions and how we can work together. But this is a very real issue, and unfortunately it's not going away tomorrow, but we can work on solutions as a community to make it better for everyone. So thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with, as a native Washingtonian born and raised in Washington, D.C., racial intolerance and racism and the need for the desire for justice, I noticed at a young age. My mother would dress me, and we would go downtown as a young child to Northwest Washington, D.C. downtown, and we would shop in certain stores. And you could see that my mother would always give me a lecture. Don't touch nothing. Don't break anything. And if certain cultural individuals or certain individuals speak to you, make sure you look them in the eye and don't turn your head and speak clear. And my mother would say, make comments like, they don't understand us, but you got to be strong and make sure that they know it. And it was early on that I learned that there were cultural differences. And not only by others, it was in my culture as well. And I knew at that point, even at a young age, that racism started at a young age. I remember the Terrence Johnson incident as a young man, and hearing of the story of this young man being accused of maybe possibly robbing a laundry and being beaten, and incidentally in a struggle, shooting and killing 2 police officers. And the comments that were made regarding the police, that they were there to brutalize us and abuse us and to keep us within our communities and neighborhoods, and that there was this intolerance for black people. And I felt such shame and disappointment. It hurt. But as I got older, I was also trained and taught that there would be a level of respect that you would have to show the police. Because certainly whenever the police approached you, it would be an injustice done to you. Now I've gotten older, and my desire for truth and justice and to see it, I've come to understand that we, or myself, and as I train and teach my child, that I must teach her to respect other cultures and to understand their history and to be aware of other cultures and experience them and respect them, and to be able to offer forgiveness to every individual, and to know when you see a person to be respectful. So my flight, my calling is to push the word of organizing forgiveness, organizing community, and that every individual would have an understanding of everyone's culture, so we can create policy and events that would change racism.
Thanks for having me here. It's actually about 37 years now of law enforcement experience, including Montgomery County, where I retired from. But first of all, there's over 750,000 law enforcement officers in the United States. There are over 1 million contacts with the public every single day. And when we talk about the bad contacts, as you talked about, the bad incidents, use of force is only used in 0.02% of all contacts, and most of those are justified. So we're talking about a very, very small number of people. Of course, it's not dog bites man, it's man bites dog, and that's news. And that's what always hits the news. Now, my new boss, or my boss that came in right after I was hired, was African American, and he came from Iowa. Okay. Now he jokes around that he's probably the only black family in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, but he grew up there. His parents were educators, and we had some frank discussions about race and racism, and it's a very hard thing for us to talk about. But one of the things that he did say to me was, if we can't talk about race, we have a bigger problem. And as soon as he said that to me, it was like, okay, he just opened the door. And we've had some very frank discussions. Fortunately, in the department that we're in right now, we have a very low number of complaints. And one of the interesting things that Tacoma Park Police does, or the whole city government actually does in Tacoma Park, is they do a citizen satisfaction survey every 3 years. The interesting thing was that we got higher scores from the minority communities, the communities of color, and the lower economic community than we did from the whites. So you can come up with your own theories for that one. I know what mine are, but I'm not going to say them in public. But in any case, we actually get very good rating. There are departments that are systemically behind the times. There are departments and training programs that are behind the times. Likewise, we see the media, we see the media pushing one side of a story in the Ferguson case, and I'll bring it up. There was no question in my mind 2 days after it that was going to be a justified use of force. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't racism in the department. That doesn't mean that there isn't that the government wasn't responsive to the communities that needed that support. That's not what I'm saying. But when we have a use of force or a police officer takes somebody's life, we as a police department have to investigate it. The officer has the same rights as anyone else that's involved in a shooting, and therefore we have to make sure we get it right. Now, I personally think that the chief in Ferguson could have done a little bit better job of getting the message out. There's nothing wrong with saying, this is what we believe happened, but it could change tomorrow. But they didn't. There was 18 hours before the first press release was made, so if you don't, the news media today is 24/7 on multiple channels, social media, everything else. If they can't get it from the source, they're going to get it from another source. I found that out the hard way here on some other issues where the media will just go to somebody and say, yeah, I heard this happen, and the next thing you know, that's what. I said, well, I was there. That's not what happened. But, so we have to take a measured approach when we look at the media reports. They do grow like wildfire. They grow legs. In the case in Ferguson, one of the things that really struck me was that the community itself did not want a lot of the outsiders coming in that were creating some of the problems. They were very, very upset about that. Most of that community were peaceful. They demonstrated. They exercised their First Amendment rights. They weren't the ones rioting. But of course now everybody thinks that Ferguson was a hotbed of emotion, and it was just a small number of people that were actually doing it, and actually a lot of outside agitators that were trying to push their own agendas. I think racism in police, there are a lot of misunderstandings that we have in the way that we approach people. We do try to teach officers better ways of approaching, more professional ways of approaching people, and now I'm talking about all people. Now, one of the things that came up in a Man-Up meeting a couple months ago with Captain Collington was somebody was giving them some very bad advice about how you should respond. Like Captain Collington said, you're not going to win on the street. That's not where you're going to win the battle. You don't ever want to, challenge the officer on the street. There are remedies that you can take. You also mentioned body-worn cameras. There's all sorts of legislation now about body-worn cameras. I actually have my department testing it. Most of us actually look forward to the fact that we can record it. Unfortunately, in Maryland, and you can take this to the legislature, we need them to change the two-party consent law so that we can actually record as audio as well. Right now we can't. So I will be more than happy to talk about some of our things. One thing I would invite anybody from the community that lives in the city of Tacoma Park, we do have a community police academy that we run twice a year. We just did our first one since I've been the chief, and we will be doing another one in the fall where you actually get to go through a mini police academy and learn how we do things. Are you a graduate? There you go. It really does open the eyes for people realizing what we do. It's not like TV. We don't shoot people in the legs. They don't always listen to what we have to say. And there's a lot of things that one thing that we like to do is we like to go home to our families at the end of the day. So sometimes people don't understand why we do things. The problem where police get in trouble sometimes is when we don't explain afterwards why we did it. And sometimes that's all it takes, is just talking to somebody afterwards and saying, hey, sorry, but we just had a robbery down the street, and guess what? The guy was wearing the exact same clothes you were, and that's why we stopped you. Sorry, we inconvenienced you. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes that won't satisfy people. I joke around about this one case I had when I was in the county. I was a sergeant, and they had a call for a person that was breaking out the windows at a gas station at 2 in the morning. He was driving a gold Mercedes, and they gave a tag number out. Well, I got behind the only gold Mercedes on Georgia Avenue at 2 in the morning, and 4 out of the 6 tag characters were the exact numbers. Pretty good idea that this might be the vehicle, right? Well, I pull him over, and of course, it's an African-American gentleman, middle-aged. Wasn't going to be him, and I tried to explain to him why I stopped him. He says, yeah, my son told me not to drive up and down Georgia Avenue. Black men can't drive up and down Georgia Avenue, you know, at 2 in the morning. And I said, did you hear what I just explained to you? I said, you know, I didn't just pick you out of nowhere. I couldn't even tell who was in the car until I stopped you. And he just didn't believe me. And sometimes you just can't convince somebody. And that's the unfortunate part. On the other hand, I'll tell a little funny story. I probably shouldn't tell it, so I'll tell it. You know, 2 hours later, I stopped a guy for doing about 85 miles an hour down Georgia Avenue with New York tags. And he stopped him. I said, do you know why I stopped you? And he was African-American. He's from New York. Very good sense of humor. He goes, you stopped me because I was speeding. I said, no, I stopped you because you were black. He just started laughing. You know, so we have to have a sense of humor. We do have to take this seriously. I think 99% of the problems and 90% of human conflict is communication. And it's really got nothing to do with anything else. It's just a lack of understanding.
Heard about Florida, Cleveland, etc., etc. I concur with the chief that this is a minority of expression, but yet it is a poignant and real phenomenon that is troubling to the actors involved, to the extended persons, whether they be family members or friends, and those of us who get a bird's eye view, quote unquote, via media. How ironic that in Orwell's book, 1984, Big Brother Watching You, that is a good and a bad thing. The enterprise of science has 3 approaches to it. You can describe the phenomena, you can explore the phenomena, or you can attempt to explain the phenomena, usually cause and effect. That latter one is real difficult with degrees of certainty. What we will probably do here today, and most of us, even though we may not be in a laboratory, is describe what we have been sensitized to. I would simply say this, as we get ready to go to question and answer. This is an age-old problem. It started, according to the Bible, when 2 brothers had an issue. Now, somebody may say, well, that's reductionist. Well, I happen to be a believer in the Word of God. And this might be a group of folk who agree with me, but since I got the microphone, I'm going to speak my conviction. And that is that Cain and Abel have been at it, and we've just contemporized it over the generations. It comes out in sexism, racism, nationalism, and all the other isms. Inhumanity of man to man. I will say this as I get ready to give you the mic. I had been in the car, and I remember one incident, and it is easy to transition to, oh, here's a white policeman coming to harass me. But I'm going to use the words of the late comedian Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor told, well, all truth is God's truth, no matter who and where it comes from. Richard said, after he had his incident where he had some milk had exploded after he put some chocolate chips in it or something. That was his way of explaining that he had a bad reaction to some inappropriate chemical mixtures, and he burned up or whatever. He said a good friend, Jim Brown, came to him.
Wow.
And Jim Brown asked him, what you gonna do? He said Jim wasn't like some of his other friends who would ask him, give me a little hit on that, or try to get me, let me share a little bit. Jim just told him, look, I ain't afraid of you. Your presence, your celebrity don't mean nothing to me. What are you gonna do? And I think our dialogue here is really, what are we gonna do? So what can this collection of people do? The first thing, like the chief said, it starts with communication. As a conflict resolution practitioner, if the parties don't communicate, they will stay entrenched this side and this side. One will use words, the next time they'll use a knife, the next time if they survive that, they'll go get a gun, and ultimately it'll be mutually assured destruction until we sit down and negotiate a win-win for both parties. So this particular, I commend you. That's a poignant and a sensitive topic, and it's a real one. But at the same time, I think it's a part of the bigger problem that we need to solve, and I hope that we can talk about it here, and maybe we may come up with some solutions today.
You advised us that it would be a good and responsible thing for us to use our phones to videotape if we see something. And I'm asking about the case of the woman in Baltimore recently. I can find her name, I'm sorry. But she tried to videotape what she thought was excessive force, and she was dragged from her car and tasered and accused falsely of trying to run over the police officers that she'd been filming, and then she was put in jail for the night when she tried to demonstrate to them that she hadn't been a threat to them and that she hadn't tried to run them over by showing them the video footage that she had on her phone. It was taken and returned to her with the video footage deleted, and then because it had been saved to her iCloud, it was available to us. I should find her name, I'm sorry. And the charges were eventually dropped, and I believe the Baltimore City, a representative of the Baltimore City police officers apologized for the rude language that a police officer was using while he was tasering her. I believe he called her a dumb. But there were no apologies made for the fact that the evidence was attempted to be destroyed, or for tasering her. So I'm bringing up this case because I personally observed something that seemed like it might have been excessive force, and I was not as brave as this woman. And I'm thinking, as we're moving forward, when we're thinking about what we can do, what specific recommendations do you have for filming or otherwise being responding that doesn't put the person doing the filming at serious risk?
As long as you are not interfering with the police work, okay? So if you're in a position, or if you're trying to position yourself and you're interfering with the police trying to, make the arrest or do what the police need to do, they will move you, okay? And they have a right to do that, and they should do that. But if you are not in a position that you're interfering with the officers, if you're not yelling, obscenities or whatever, if you are just simply filming, you should not be arrested by the police. The police shouldn't even approach you because you are just exercising your rights as a citizen. And I'll, of course, let the officer here, who may or may not have dealt with it, firsthand. But that's what I would advise you. I hope that more people will be brave, because again, had my client's cousin not videotaped this incident, my client would have been, he was arrested, he was detained, but he was charged, he would have been prosecuted, he would have likely been either found guilty or forced to take a plea because he wouldn't believe he would be able to put up a defense, because due deference is given to officers. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, because our officers are here to protect and serve us. And so having them getting some deference in our judicial system, I don't think should be seen as negative. But the problem is, because we don't have the trust that we need in our officers, there are a lot of people who are very suspicious of, well, was that a racially motivated stop? Did they really, attack this? I mean, because our officers, and I think are good officers, and here's where, and I'm sure we'll have some debate about it, here's where I have a problem with our really good officers. Many times, because they're doing what's right, they don't want to acknowledge that there are people on their police force that shouldn't be there, or need some additional training, or need psychological evaluations because something is going on. And because there's this denial that seems to happen, we become suspicious of all police, and that's not a good thing for society. We should not be suspicious of these men and women who are laying down their lives every day. I respect what they do. But they have to also understand that there is an issue out there, that there are officers who are doing things that are racially motivated, who are sexist, who are homophobic, who have all of, that there are these issues out there. And how do we address it as a community? Instead of it being us against them, which, oh, by the way, when I was in Annapolis, there were 17 police reform bills in Annapolis this year in the House Judiciary Committee. There was not one bill that the police union supported in any measure, okay? And what it did was it pit the citizens against the police. Well, I think there were some bills that were, maybe, I think they were well-intentioned, but I don't think that they were, that they probably could have been drafted better, or maybe there could have been a different outcome or whatever. But for the police just to come down and oppose everything without any solutions and basically say, well, hey, everything's fine, there's just a couple of bad actors out there, so we don't need to change any part of our system, not one part of our system, in order to address it, it makes it seem like they're just protecting their own, even the bad ones. And so that's the problem that we're having, and that's why I'm so happy that we have a chief here today, so that we can really talk about how do we get past this issue of wanting to protect, officers, or protect the current system when there are clearly some flaws, clearly some things that can be done differently. How do we get to a place where we can have some reform in our criminal justice system, that officers are willing to negotiate and to discuss with the community? I think that's all the community wants. They want to know that you acknowledge that there are some issues and that you're willing to step up and figure out some solutions to those issues.
Yeah, let me add on to that. One of my friends, who is probably one of the leaders in use of force and non-lethal force in the United States, he describes police use of force as like, public safety is like making sausage. A lot of people like eating it, but you don't want to watch it being made. So sometimes when you see something that you think is brutal, it may not be. And it looks a lot worse on video, out of context, out of what the officer's experience and training is. Then there are cases of brutality. There's no question. But just understand that sometimes use of force is not pretty, and nothing says the police have to use equal force. It just has to be objectively reasonable force. That's what the Supreme Court says. As far as photographing, as long as you're standing in a place that is constitutionally protected, like in public, you're okay taking pictures of the police. Now, a lot of times you'll see these videos where the people are screaming just as loud, inciting other people. If you're going to do the photography, keep your mouth shut, do the photography. Don't get involved in the incident. I agree with you about the trust issue. We have to be able to have the community trust us, but and we also have to be able to trust the community. It's a two-way street. When you look at the legislation, I was chuckling because this is probably the first time that the police unions and police management scratched their heads and got together, because usually we're fighting each other at the legislature. There was a lot of bills in there that were knee-jerks because there was a lot of misunderstanding. People say, well, you can't get rid of a police officer that's bad in the state of Maryland because the police officers, the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights. Well, that's not exactly true. Most of the bills came out of Baltimore because there were a couple of cops up in Baltimore they were trying to get rid of, and they have a brand new chief that came from, or commissioner that came from California, and his staff told him, you can't get rid of this guy because of this, this, and this, and they didn't understand. Yes, you can. I can tell you that in Montgomery County, the number of internally generated complaints from fellow officers and from supervisors outnumbers the complaints from external sources. The days of the thin blue line where nobody speaks, the code of silence, are gone. No cop is going to give up his career for another cop that commits a crime. In action in the state of Maryland, and actually most places, if I see somebody beating a guy and it was not a justified use of force, if I'm standing there, if I don't take action, then I'm just as liable. And you're not going to see I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's a culture in a lot of police departments, but that culture is changing because the case law is there and officers are going to jail. But the other thing I'd like to point out is that there's a difference between misconduct in office and making a mistake. Because we are human. Sometimes cops make bad judgments, make bad decisions under stress. When an officer has to make a decision, it may be in a split second. And it may not be the best decision. It may be a policy violation. It may even be a violation of the law as far as the interpretation of the law. But there is a big difference between mistakes and misconduct. In the case you're talking about, that's misconduct. That's a crime. That's perjury. It's false imprisonment. But in most cases, when an officer does something wrong, it's because they made a mistake. As long as we are willing to look at that and say, okay, you made a mistake, here's how we're going to correct it, that's the important part.
Yeah, I want to. That particular case, I'm not aware of, which is an example of how finite the human personality is. And I'm going to be left to you signaling it to me or the interpretation of someone who, and I'm not doubting you, I'm just telling you.
But I can tell you her name. If
No, that's not what
okay.
The point I'm making is each one of us is limited by the ability of information we can be aware of and gather. Here's my point. I think it's John Locke, that this is a social contract. It is not perfect. It becomes acutely my concern when the issue involves me directly. But yet, as a part of this land of the free, the home of the brave, with the ugly history as an Afro-American, knowing how we've been mistreated, when I hear or if I experience it, the question goes back to what Richard recited. What am I going to do? We have a constitution that says I have due process, I have equal protection under the law, there is supposed to be the value of fairness. I think I heard you said that she at least started some litigation and got some kind of resolution or may be in process. I think what we need to do is we need to become advocates for public policy. We need to talk to, and I'm glad to hear the police chief say that the police need more sensitivity training, and that's ongoing. And as our attorney alluded to, we can't have cover-ups. And when we detect it, we as citizens of the United States or wherever our municipality is, we have to raise that issue. And like the old spiritual said, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. We've got to fight. And like James Meredith said when he was going to the University of Mississippi, you have to have a death move, a willingness to die. And that's the real issue. Some of us will talk because it's chic to talk right now. Everybody talking about it. But to actually put your life on the line to deal with Cain and Abel, it's going to take some blood, sweat, and tears.
Yes, sir.
if I could piggyback briefly what Reverend said, but I heard of that case. I don't remember the person's name, but someone mentioned it. Someone mentioned it.
Kianga Mwamba.
Okay. Kianga, I heard of the case briefly. Someone mentioned it. A Baltimore City government employee mentioned it to me. And I will say that the next question is, what are we going to do now, as Reverend said, to organize? Even if the police, Chief, statement is kind of frightening to me. It sounds like there's a gray area of identifying what is abusive and excessive force and what isn't. In my eyes, I could be wrong. Abuse. If I'm being beat over the head, I'm being beat over the head. But that appears to be abuse. Yeah. Not knowing the reason, if you're watching from afar, but abuse is abuse if someone is unarmed with a phone. That appears to be abuse to me. But the question is, now that, what was her name?
Kianga Mwamba.
Kianga has been identified. What, as a community, how are we going to organize and to make sure that another person is not being abused with a camera phone? What we would want to do is to call together other social action or nonprofits in the area or within that community and advocate not only on her behalf and for future victims, to organize and that so that we can monitor not only that police officer but others, so that we can hold individuals accountable.
And I worked at a college just outside Boston, and the police officers in that area, because there's so many colleges and universities in Boston, take special training so that when they step foot on a college or university campus, their approach is different. Is there differentiation here in Maryland?
When we train use of force, we train different options, and use of force doesn't start with a baton, it doesn't start with the OC spray, it doesn't start with a taser or a gun, unless it's a deadly force situation. We do teach our officers how to communicate, how to mediate. 99% of what we do is trying to de-escalate the situation, but it takes two people to de-escalate. And in the very, very rare cases where it comes to a use of force, and this vast majority of police contact, the force has to be objectively reasonable. Not necessary, not equal, but objectively reasonable under the Supreme Court. So, yes, we do. We teach de-escalation techniques. We do teach people how to talk to people. There's always, you always want to start off at a lower level when you can. I mean, the circumstances of the case may dictate it. If somebody's beating the heck out of somebody else, talking to them might not be the best thing to do. You're going to have to separate.
My question was whether there's a difference in the approach on a college or university campus. In Boston, I know there's special training for that because I dealt with the police when I was working against.
No, we don't. There's different mindsets, because if you look at the University of Maryland, which is a huge school right down the street from us, they have a whole different issue, a group of problems that they deal with every day, whether it's drinking and drugs and stuff on campus. For us, we have a community college which is not residential, and we have this university that's quasi-residential. So no, I mean, we really don't do it differently. We treat people with respect and fairly. And I think that one of the things that we teach is, obviously when people are younger and their brains aren't fully developed until age 24, they tend to take more risks. They tend to be a little bit more impulsive. So yeah, the officers recognize that. They understand that. I've been accused of never growing up, so I mean, hopefully but there are differences in people that are 16 and 17 years old and people that are 30.
That was my question. Thank you, Chief.
I want to commend you for what you're doing here today, because it at least ignites the possibility of the human mind, which God has wired to come up with solutions. Some weeks ago, not too long after the Ferguson incident at my particular church, we invited the county police to come, and during our AY session in the afternoon, just to open up dialogue. It's amazing that in a church setting, people have, we can be influenced by the media one way or the other, but to sit down with another individual, look them eyeball to eyeball, and to listen to them will stimulate ideas that God has put within us to find solutions. Eric Erickson, child psychologist, talks about human development. He talks about emulation. Well, to hear that stimulates me that I'm going to find something that I can emulate that goes on in Massachusetts. And Chief, whether you have it in place now, a part of your training might be look across the border, see if what they're doing in Massachusetts can enhance what you're doing here, and how I can help you do that or anybody else. We want to be better. We want to be the head and not the tail. So I appreciate that.
It may be that just a small percentage of the encounters with police officers go violent. Yet there are some police departments in this country, Ferguson is one of them, Philadelphia is another one, and there are probably a whole lot of others, where there's a culture of violence with respect to dealing with the communities of color and other communities. And we remember from New York the notion of, what was the guy's name? Mayor Giuliani, who lifted up that culture and inspired it and celebrated it. Okay, now it's one thing to talk about what we're going to do in Montgomery County in order to keep these awful incidents from taking place. It's another thing to talk about larger social issues in terms of these pockets of police administration in the United States which have gone really wrong with respect to communities of color. That's one thing. But there's a book that's recently been published by a journalist named Matt Taibbi, T-A-I-B-B-I, called The Divide. Has anybody in here read that book? Are there any social work folk in here? All the social work folks should read this book. It's about police maladministration, about the justice system writ large. And what it suggests is that there's a differential law enforcement that takes place in the country. And the most dramatic thing was these communities of color, which are low income, or which are oppressed, or whatever term you want to put on them, you can go to jail for a long period of time for standing on the street corner, or for addressing a policeman in the wrong way. And that absolutely happens. I'm not trying to insult you, Chief, or to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to suggest that there's some other parts of this that we don't deal with here. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, arguably the largest transfer of wealth in a short period of time has just taken place. That's what this financial crisis is. Arguably the largest transfer of wealth in a short period of time has just taken place. The guys who are responsible for that, not one of them has done 1 day in jail. Right. So there is a divide here. Right. And we need to, at some point, talk about some aspects of that. Did that get to what you want, or you want to go somewhere else?
No, let me go somewhere else.
Okay, let's do this issue. If you all want to address that, or somebody wants to say something about that, or ask a question about that, let's do that first, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, we really wouldn't even be here if this were not an issue.
Right.
So, with all due respect, I know that there are areas, in particular in our state, and I think Tacoma, first of all, is an exciting example of what America could be, because there's a lot of diversity, a lot of inclusion, and a lot of tolerance. But in a lot of places, that just does not happen. I'm from Prince George's County, and for years, our police department was under, federal monitoring by the Justice Department, because we've had, I think our canine unit in particular had a lot of incidents where they were using the canine to attack people of color. The Maryland State Police. By the way, my last piece of legislation that I passed as a state delegate was a bill that required the state police to diversify its ranks, because they had lost 37% of the black state troopers. And out of 1,400, I think at the time, 1,430 or so state troopers, only 29 were Hispanic. And so when you look at a state that is growing in its minority population, and you see these huge declines in African American officers and very few Hispanic officers, mainly because of the culture of the state police. If they're not treating their own officers in a respectful way, and if they're not getting opportunities for upward mobility, then what do you think happens on the streets with these same officers that are being discriminating intra-department? And so these are real issues. The Maryland State Police was under a consent decree with the Justice Department as well because of their racial profiling. And another bill that I passed when I was there reauthorized our racial profiling statute because guess what? It's still happening. People are still getting stopped disproportionately here in the state of Maryland. So it is a very real issue. We can't deny it, and we can't pretend like it's just a very minuscule kind of thing. Otherwise, you all have better things to do with your life and your time. You certainly wouldn't be here discussing something that wasn't a real issue.
Yes, sir.
You shifted us now from police per se to the structural and the hidden forces. You speak about Philadelphia. I'm raised in Philadelphia, and I know that it is ironic that the name says Philadelphia, brotherly love, but there has been a lot of unbrotherly behavior. Some of it has centered around police. I know up in Broad Street, Erie, that district got a lot of felons or folk who were convicted, freed because of misbehavior of police. But again, I go back to this. What are we going to do?
There you are.
And each one of us must, where we are, as centers of influence in your church, your mosque, your temple, your social agency, when these things arise, you've got to get involved at some level. We can't just talk. Now let me close up with this on this particular point. Here's my anxiety. I'm a preacher. Martin Luther King was a preacher. Most of these civil rights spokespersons look like me. I need to hear my white counterparts more vocal.
That's right.
Because the majority of America, 300 plus million, don't look like me. And the victims are the ones that's doing a lot of the talking and crying out. But the culture and the structural things that have been put in place, plausibly denied, preachers, white preachers have gone to bed. They talk about a whole lot of other things. They need to now take the front line to talk to their parishioners who are the social economic purveyors and maintainers of generational racism. I'm going to pray, and whenever I can talk to them, I'm going to tell them, I want to hear you talk with me. Because we can change it a little bit better, a little bit faster, if you preach on Sunday or Saturday, whenever you preach it, because your folk are on Wall Street. Your folk are on Main Street and shifting wealth while we talking about going to heaven. You occupying down here and doing injustice to folk who are really trying to live this American dream.
White parent partnered with another female raising 2 African-American boys who are 5 and 8. So personally, close to my heart. As a white person, I've been working on racism and white privilege for most of my life, but it's different now that I'm raising black boys. And so there's a couple things. One is in terms of what you were saying, sir. Part of what I have to do as a white person, work with other white people. Make sure that we as white people take a look at our privilege, what the impact is, what our role is, how do we use our privilege for the sake of people that don't have the privilege? How do we use the power we have, economically, racially, gender-wise, however we are, to make change happen in the places that we do? That's one thing. The other is, as a parent of young children, how do I look at Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and the School to Prison Pipeline, and how do I look at the school systems my kids are in and what the work is those school systems are doing around racial justice, because that's where it starts. The jail systems, all of that stuff starts when the kids are in kindergarten, preschool. They get set up then. So how do we pay attention in terms of our action plans, which is one of the things I'm doing, is working in the school systems to try to have them look at what they're doing around detention, all the things they're doing around that. That's the second point. The third point is we met after, during Black Lives Matter, we had our neighborhood, I live in Tacoma Park, we had a neighborhood meeting at our house. We raised money for showing up for racial justice for the people that are were getting arrested. But we talked as a neighborhood about what we were going to do. And one of the things we talked about was, how do we engage with the police? And one of the things that we came up with was, what about trying to have some kind of a dialogue within the community of community people and police officers so that we could get to know each other better?
Melissa Henley, I'm a faculty member here in the social work department and former foster parent, former foster care social worker. So I appreciate parents who adopt and or foster. Because that is in fact a ministry. My question then would be, and this goes for anybody who may consider fostering and or adopting. If you are adopting a minority, visible minority child, I heard you say that you have to partner with white people. White, I don't want to misquote you.
No, my partner, who I'm married to, is a woman.
Right, but you said something about that you have to work with.
Well, there's a lot to say. One of the areas that I work in is with other white people. There's also a lot of work I'm doing on cross-racial lines. Okay, so that's what I'm curious to know. So how do you help your sons to develop a sense of identity as little black boys, soon to be black men, particularly in the day and age that we're living in? How do you do that? I'm just curious. They hang around and spend most of their time in black communities. I have mentors for them who are black men because they don't have men in their home. They don't have black people in their immediate home. So we have a number of different programs that we've gotten ourselves involved in so that they have a sense of that. One of the things we had to talk about with Ferguson is, how do I, as a white parent, help them understand about the police?
Okay, and that's exactly
which is one of the questions I was going to have, which is, I told my 5-year-old about Tamir Rice. He said, I want to go out and play and pretend guns. I said, you're not doing that. You will get killed, possibly. And so what's the line, as a parent, of wanting to teach my kid how he's got to grow up as a black boy, eventually a black man, who will get pulled over way more times than most other people. How does he handle himself? I've already talked with them about how they've got to behave and do all of that, and then I reinforce it with the black people in our lives who then tell them again, because if they're just looking at us as white parents, how do we know? So we reinforce it with other African American and people of color who can reinforce it to them from their lived experience, since it's not mine. And then the question is, how do we, how do I help them build this gap of like, okay, you got to act this way. You can't quite trust the police, but you kind of got to, like, how do we change the tide in our world of institutionalized racism that's everywhere? And the relationship with the police, how do I teach them that?
And I'm just going to say this and then I'll sit. You use some very strong language, institutionalized, and they can't trust the police, but maybe they can. And certainly, I don't have kids, but I hear you. And it concerns me, what would I teach my young black sons and daughters? Because young black girls are gunned down all the time by police as well. No disrespect to the police chief here. So the fact that here we have a white mom raising black boys who is saying that this is in fact an issue, to the point of Aisha, I'm sorry. We do have to have these uncomfortable discussions, because the more that we continue to not, or have it behind closed doors with our own friends and family, this issue is not going to be eradicated.
My concern is that, we're talking about what we're going to do. And one of the things I was thinking of is that we need civic education. I know we do civic education, but I mean how the police treat us and how we respond to the police. I'm a very quiet, peaceable person. I got lost one night. I saw a police car. I had been trained to trust the police and that they're to help you. I got out of my car to go to the police car. He screamed at me. I couldn't understand what he was saying because he was screaming, but he was saying, get back in your car. I didn't expect that reaction, so I didn't pick up, get back in your car. So when, after all, he did, he was embarrassed, he put the light in my whatever. But what I'm saying is we need to understand what the police do. The police need to understand, we need to be told how to respond, how to respect, how to act when we're stopped by police. Police also need to realize that all of us do not understand them. We're coming from different groups and areas, and when they scream, we don't understand what they're saying. And so it's a miscommunication, as you said. And so I think we need to put in our civic education, wherever we do it, something about police, how we relate to police, and also in training the police, teach them a lot about minorities and how to treat them. I think that a lot of the police, like us human beings, come in with our preconceived ideas of who and what people are, and when they meet them on the street, they react that way to them. Because there was no reason for him to be screaming at me, but he was scared, but I had my hands out, I didn't have no gun. And I was scared because I was lost, but he obviously had some issues. So civic education is one of the things.
Police administration is just one part of this, especially in terms of what this lady right here has said, in terms of a whole congeries of issues that we have to deal with. There are different parts of this thing. And the way the thing is developed now is that the police issue gets to be front and center. And we focus on that, but we have to look, following this conversation here, at the much broader thing. Do we not have to do that if we're going to engage in a realistic conversation about what's going on here? Yes.
Okay, let me comment on that. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. As far as the police are the most visible arm of the government. Right. Okay. In Ferguson, it wasn't about the police. It was about the government. It was about being disenfranchised. But because the police are the ones out there, right, unfortunately, we have to cure all the ills of social injustice, because that's what whether it's mental illness or crime or high taxes, the police get beat over the head to why aren't you doing something about it, because we are that visible arm of the government. And I just want to make another comment about profiling. Profiling is part of police work. Racial profiling may be part of police work, because if I'm looking for an African American or a Chinese or a white guy, that's what I'm looking for. It's inappropriate profiling that we need to fight. That's the difference. And we need to get away from saying racial profiling. It's inappropriate profiling.
Well, it's not just the police that do the profiling, it's a bunch of other institutions, which is the point. Yes, sir.
I am going to give you a solution that I normally charge folk for. For the last, that is true, but it eats my rent, so I know it works. For the last year, I have worked for Lieutenant Governor Anthony Brown as the Faith and Religious Outreach Coordinator, and it was my job to create relationships across the board in the faith community. And I was working on an idea that would bring the faith community together, and we would do somewhat, for lack of a better word, a caravan across the state of Maryland in different counties and regions of Maryland, where we would bring the faith community together. And all of the resources, whether it was the Jewish community, the Islamic community, the Christian community, the Buddhists, if you offered a program, if you were doing education, whether regarding reconciliation, racial profiling, or whatever you may offer, our goal in the Faith and Outreach Department, if we had one, I'm still a little salty, if we had one of the goals would have been was to bring the community together. Here at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you want to know what you can do? Yes. Count the number of members within your Saturday service. Please forgive me. I'm a Sunday goer. In your Saturday church service, your resources. Create an agenda which will go within those communities where your churches are. Take your resources and educate those communities. Just like you're holding this forum, hold another forum across the state of Maryland or wherever you may be in this country and engage the community. Create an agenda, offer the resources, create a referral system, and refer individuals to where they need to be. The young lady who was beaten, maybe she needs therapy. She needs a pro bono lawyer. We now have to, the connectional church has to be a connection, engaging the community and creating outcomes that positively affect the community.
You know, one of the things that I have lots of friends in law enforcement, and one of the things I asked one of our local chiefs of one of our municipalities is whether or not during their actual training, you know, do you get to actually meet with young people, not, you know, but just like in a casual setting, like having a dialogue with them during your training. So you're training to become a police officer. These are the young people out in the community that you're going to be interacting with, meeting with. Do you, as part of your training, have, as part of that, an opportunity to really interact on a more social level with young people? Because I think one of the things that an attorney who I know does a lot of the civil rights work, he said one thing, and when I heard him say it made me cringe. He said, black men are killable. And what that meant to him was that it is easier for officers or anyone to kill a black person because their lives are not valued as much as others. But if you have an opportunity to have a conversation with someone beyond what you're used to, because a lot of our officers are coming from places like, we recruit from West Virginia, from parts of Pennsylvania that are not as diverse as we are here in the state of Maryland and certain of our localities. A lot of these officers may have never had a relationship with someone who didn't look like them. And then to put that individual in a neighborhood where they're serving them, it can be uncomfortable, I'm sure, on both sides. But as part of the training, we had an opportunity to actually build friendships and relationships with, especially our young people in the community. I think that is key, because it is less likely that you're going to take the ultimate action to potentially kill someone or to hurt them if you feel like you know them. And that's what's not happening in many of our communities. Our officers, they're not beat cops anymore. They're not walking the streets. They're not interacting with people anymore. They're cruising around, which maybe there's some efficiency there. Maybe that's, the strategies. I'm not going to question their strategies, but my point is we don't have the relationships anymore. And we've got to get back to having those relationships.
All right, thank you very much.
The point that you just made was very similar to the one that I made, and that was, I feel I'm kind of being neutral, and I think sometimes as black people we play the victim role, and sometimes, honestly, not to discount anything, sometimes if we see a white officer coming to us, we automatically think that they are profiling us when sometimes we actually are in the wrong. And I think that we have to first of all, the police force has to stop the profiling, but we also have to begin respecting the police. And I think a lot of our young men, because we're always told that they're profiling us, we have a disrespect for police as well. And I think that we need to all work together if we are to find a solution.
I think that, similar to what you said, there's it's an awkward conversation. I feel like for black young men, I know for me growing up, going to black schools, being surrounded by black people most of the time, when you have an interaction with a white officer, it's automatic, like, it's always awkward, you know, it's like we don't even know how to respond, how to, you know, speak to them. It's like automatically, yes sir, you know, putting our heads down. So that interaction is always, I feel like you said, you know, we have officers that come from different places where they don't get to interact with black people on a regular, and it's the same thing for black people. We don't get the chance to interact with officers in our schools, or like you said, see them on the street, coming to basketball games. We don't get that. So I think it's like there's a double standard to it. So yeah, that's just my
you know, you can't make those assumptions, because we do. You know, I work for different police departments. I can tell you, when I was in college, I was working security and for a security company for minimum wage, and they sent me to this place called Wheeler Road in D.C. without a gun. My office was a burned out office laundromat that was burned out from the 1960s riots that still hadn't been repaired in the 1970s. And I was walking foot patrol in a neighborhood that I grew up in Montgomery. I grew up in Aspen Hill. Okay, you're absolutely right. So. But you know what? I was sitting there twirling my nightstick, because my dad was a New York City beat cop, and he twirled his nightstick and taught me how. And it broke the ice. And this guy came up to me and said, "I haven't seen that since I left New York." And we started talking. And then there was another group of people that weren't as kind to me. They were about ready to kick my rear end, and he intervened. Okay, so yes, building those relationships are important. But I think it's just as bad, you know, if we're going to talk about racism and prejudice, let's talk about it the other way around. Don't always assume that the officers are coming from this point of view. As well as when I got to Tacoma Park Police, I mean, I was totally unprepared for it. The first award ceremony we had, I'm trying to figure out who came with who. And we have white officers married to black women married to white guys, whites to Asians. You know, and I had and you really needed a scorecard. And actually, my boss said the same thing. It's like, okay, but we never saw that before. And that's the sort of the mindset in the department that I'm working in now. You're absolutely right. You go some places.